Hi, welcome back everybody. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about chapter 3 so that you guys can understand how energy and matter cycle through an ecosystem and how this helps everybody stay alive. But before we can do that, we have to review a couple key principles which will help everything, kind of makes sense. So the first thing is the building blocks of living things. So you have to remember what the building blocks of living things are, okay? In class, we talked about these things called molecules, and those molecules are made up of atoms, okay? Some molecules that are super important that we need to remember are amino acids, okay? So these molecules are needed to make things, or these macromolecules, really big molecules that are called proteins, okay? So all living things need amino acids so that they can make their proteins. We also talked about some molecules that were called carbohydrates, and we spent most of our time talking about glucose. Glucose, if you remember, looks like this, all right? So it has carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, very important molecule, right? And why is this important molecule so important? Because it allows us to make chemical energy, and also it allows that molecule to build larger molecules called starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Starch and cellulose are some very huge polysaccharides that help plants grow. Then we have nucleotides. Nucleotides are some more molecules that we need so that we can make larger molecules, or macromolecules called DNA and RNA. And remember, DNA and RNA, that stores our genetic information. And finally, some other molecules that we did not build in class, okay, fatty acids and glycerols, those help us build some larger macromolecules and certain structures like cell membranes, and they also help with energy storage, okay? So all living things, regardless of what we're talking about, unicellular, multicellular, all living things need amino acids, carbohydrates, nucleotides, and fatty acids, okay? And they use these smaller molecules to make these huge molecules, and these huge molecules come together to help form cells, and cells come together to form tissues, and tissues come together to form organs, and organs come together to form organ systems, and organ systems come together to form us, all right? So it's this huge process of scale where one building block is used to make other things, and so forth and so forth. But these are the basics. If you understand this, then you can understand what's coming up next. So let's talk about how all this comes together. Okay, so now let's pretend that Earth looks like this. There's land, there's the sun, there's gases in our atmosphere that are made up of these molecules like CO2, N2, H2O. So CO2, remember, it looks like this, so that would be that. Okay, and N2 looks like this, right? And then H2O, you guys should remember what that looks like, right? So let's imagine that we live in a world that looks like this. Now, currently, there couldn't be any plants, okay? Plants cannot exist in this environment. Why not? Because, we do have the sun, we have the CO2, we have water. Why can't plants exist? The reason why plants can't exist is because there's only N2, okay? And plants, actually, what they need is NH3. That's what they need. That's what plants need. And so there are these bacteria, all right? Bacteria are single cells, okay? Bacteria. And bacteria, what it does, there's certain types of bacteria that take the nitrogen and turn it into NH3, which is called ammonia. ammonia. Now, this process right here is called nitrogen fixation. Fixation. It's like you're fixing nitrogen to be NH3. And now that there's bacteria that produces NH3, right? So now we have NH3 on the ground. Now we can have a plant. So there's the leaves. There's the leaves. Okay, boom. And let's give it some pretty petals here, right? So now, okay, we can have a plant. Because if we take a look at, for example, the cells of a plant cell. So let's look at it. And then the reason why I'm drawing a plant cell like this is because they have this cell wall. And inside the cell wall, okay, there's the cell membrane. Okay, and so that's what this looks like. So the reason why plants need NH3 is because the NH3 is going to go into the plant, and it's going to allow the plant cells to make amino acids. Okay, and so that's why they need the NH3, because remember, if you remember, amino acids, okay, kind of look like this. For the most part, all of them look like this. And they need the nitrogen from the NH3 to make their amino acids, okay? Now, also, they're going to need some of that nitrogen to make its DNA and its RNA, okay? And so that's why we need bacteria, so that the plants can take the N2 and turn it into NH3 so that the plants can use it, okay? And that process is called nitrogen fixation. Now, the plant needs to grow, okay, continue to grow, and so far, we haven't talked about that process. So how do plants grow? How do they stay alive? And so that's where we need the next reaction, which is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis reaction, okay? And so what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is when a plant takes in CO2 and it's gonna take in the water, okay? And it's gonna use this CO2 and water in this proportion, so 6 CO2 plus 6 water molecules. And what it's gonna do, it's going to allow it to make its glucose. And glucose, if you remember, has the following formula, C6H12O6, right? And if you count the atoms, there should be something left here that needs to go out into the air, okay, from the plant, and that is the O2. So now that there's a plant, there's going to be O2 in the air now, okay, because that's a product of photosynthesis. And actually, every time the plant makes one glucose molecule, every time makes one of these, it's going to make 6 O2s, 6 of these, okay? And so that's how the O2 gets into the atmosphere, into the air, right? And so now, if you take a look over here, this plant cell has all the things that we talked about. It has its DNA, it has its carbohydrates, it has its amino acids to build its proteins, okay? And the lipids are going to be made through other chemical reactions in the cell. So the phospholipids, the fatty acids, and all that stuff, those are going to be made through chemical reactions, because remember, there's also carbon in the ground, all right? Because there's dead matter, like for example, let's just draw somebody with okay, or like that. There's dead things in there, and then there's these bacteria that decompose and return the carbon back into the ground, and so that's how plants can get more carbon. So, but for our purposes, what we want to focus is our attention on photosynthesis, okay, and nitrogen fixation. Okay, nitrogen fixation fixes the N2 so that we have our NH3 so we can have our amino acids. Photosynthesis allows the plant to use the water and the CO2 to make the glucose, right? Okay, the glucose. And without the sun, there wouldn't be any energy to power this reaction. So the sun is what powers photosynthesis, because photo means light, synthesis means to make. So so photosynthesis uses the energy from the sun to make glucose, and now we have a plant cell with everything that it needs to stay alive and continue to thrive. All right? Okay? So now how does this affect us, or how does this affect animals? Now, here we have a cow, okay? All right, or a cow, which is an animal. Now, the cow, okay, is going to consume or eat the plant cells. And when it eats the plant cells, it's getting its DNA. It's going to eat the amino acids that are in there, the RNA, the glucose, okay? So think of a plant cell almost like your little, your little bags of Doritos or something, but that's literally what the cow's doing. When it eats plant cells, it's getting all these things that we talked about, okay? So now, okay, it gets all this stuff, and if we look at the cells of a cow, now the cow's going to get more DNA, it's going to get more amino acids by eating the plant, and it's going to get its glucose, okay, from the plant, because the plant is pretty much, glucose, right? And so what is the animal cells going to do with that glucose? Well, that glucose is going to go into the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria, it's going to use it to make this chemical energy called ATP. And another thing that it's going to make is CO2, right? And this CO2 goes back from all the cells in the body, okay, to the lungs, and then we're going to breathe out the CO2. And that's going to get into the atmosphere. Got it? Okay, another thing that is super important is, remember, now in the air there's O2. Okay, O2 as well, right? And this O2 we're going to breathe in, and now the O2 is going to go into the cells, and it's going to also go into the mitochondria, which is also going to allow for the products, which is that, to occur. And so this process is called cellular respiration. And if you notice what went in, and it happens in the mitochondria. So the glucose, which is C6H12O6, becomes a reaction, okay, the reactant, and that produces, okay, actually the CO2, reduces water, and produces the chemical energy called ATP. And to make it correct, every time one molecule of glucose, okay, is used to make chemical. So now, okay, to recap, cellular respiration is a process that happens in animals and in humans, and it happens in the mitochondria. And this process basically involves glucose, okay, going into the mitochondria, oxygen going into the mitochondria, and this oxygen and the glucose helps the cells, the animal cells and our cells, make chemical energy called ATP. And a product is molecules of CO2 and molecules of H2O. And so now these molecules, okay, you might think, oh, how do we make water, right? But they're tiny little molecules. It's like throwing, a drop of water into the ocean. It doesn't make a big difference. But the CO2, that is what we produce. It's almost, think of it like our exhaust. And that CO2, remember, we breathe it out, and that's how it gets into the atmosphere. So now let's talk about, how this affects us. So now here we have, okay, a little boy, okay? And this little boy needs to grow, needs to stay alive. And for the most part, remember, okay, the boy, just like the cow, is considered a consumer. The reason why it's a consumer is because it's going to eat, okay, plants. It's going to eat animals. Okay, like meat. Like when we eat animals, when we eat meat, we're eating animal cells, right? And so when it eats plants and animals, that's how it's getting its DNA building blocks, its amino acid building blocks, its RNA building blocks. When you eat the plant, you are getting tons of carbohydrates, okay, in the form of glucose. When you eat the animal cell, you're gonna get the majority of your amino acids so that you can build your proteins that you need. You're gonna get more DNA, you're gonna get more RNA. So you're getting all those building blocks, okay, that your cells are going to need so that you can grow and prosper. So think of the cells of plants and animal cells like little snack bags that have all these little molecular snacks that we're going to, have all these molecular or these molecules that we're going to need for our cells. So, and if you look at our cells, like a human cell, it's going to look much like an animal cell. It's going to have its DNA, it's going to have amino acids in there, it's going to have a bunch of organelles like a mitochondria, lysosomes, okay, all these other things, and it's going to need glucose, okay, it's going to have lipids around the cell membrane and so forth. And so, but all the things in there, that's how we get them, by consuming or eating the plants and animal cells. So that's why we are considered consumers. We're also considered heterotrophs because we need a different source of energy like glucose, right? We cannot make our energy. We have to consume or get our energy from somewhere else, right? And so that's one of the big terms that you have to remember. We need a different source of energy. We can't make the energy ourselves. Same thing with the cow. The cow or any other animal is a consumer because it has to eat, right? And it's a heterotroph because it can't make its own energy. It needs a different source of energy, right? And then, okay, remember our friend, the plant, right? All right, this one actually super complicated, but the plant is actually a producer. And the reason why it's a producer, it's because it produces all the stuff from the beginning. Okay, they start producing the initial amino acids that are going to be eaten by animals, all right? Okay, they're going to produce the glucose, okay? Without plants, there is no glucose. The only carbon molecules that would exist would be CO2, right? Okay, glucose is produced by the plant, okay? By you, and they also produce the oxygen that we're going to need. So plants are called producers. They're also called autotrophs Because they can harness the energy from the sun, okay? And so in another way of doing is they can use their own energy or produce their own energy. And so without plants, okay, we wouldn't have all these building blocks that we need so that animals can eat them. And then without those, then we wouldn't have the things that we need to survive. So this whole process, okay, of staying alive is a cyclical process, okay? And so hopefully this helps. And just remember, okay, that everything needs one another. Producers produce all the molecules that we need to stay alive. Okay, we consume those cells that are full of these molecules so that we have the molecules we need to stay alive and grow. Cows do the same thing. And also remember that in our cells as well, we have mitochondria. And these mitochondria need the glucose, need the O2, okay, so that they can produce the ATP, okay, and in the process, it's gonna make the water, all right, and that's the CO2 that's going to let out into the atmosphere, and we call this process cellular respiration, okay, and good thing that respiration occurs in us, because if it wasn't for respiration, then there wouldn't be any CO2 for plants, right? Because remember, look at, they need the CO2. Without us and animals, plants wouldn't have the CO2 that they need. So remember, we all are interdependent on one another. Some of plants are producers, we are consumers, and we need one another. So hopefully this helps. See you next time.